Looking at how many slabs are already in circulation and how huge the numbers are that large partnerships are handling, personally, I get the impression that this market might be getting a little dangerous. Hi, today, for a change, we're recording from our flagship store's headquarters, Card Horizon, in Warsaw. We invite everyone visiting Warsaw to stop by our store. And the main reason I wanted to talk to you today is to share some fresh thoughts and reflections. I'm fresh off the card show, which I had the pleasure of attending last weekend in Birmingham, in the UK. I combined it with a short summer trip to the UK, but I was also very curious. I wanted to see what the card market, the popularity of the hobby, and the overall atmosphere looked like outside the European Union. I was also interested in the prices of different products and cards, which products are attracting attention. My conclusions are, at least for me, potentially surprising. Looking at the interest at Card Horizon right now, Pokemon cards are selling above everything else because they are really the blue chip of the card market. Of course, there are other card games too, and they are also holding up very strongly, especially the so-called Big Five, One Piece in particular, but of course also Magic and Riftbound. Smaller games like Lorcana and Star Wars, you could say, are at least not on a bad trajectory. Rather, they're maintaining a certain level of popularity and riding the wave of all the hype currently dominating the card game market. But as we all know, the main fuel behind this is first and foremost Pokemon. Of course, it was not quite as obvious on the vendor side because card show organizers in different parts of Europe make sure that there is interest from both vendors and customers. It mainly revolves around Pokemon, but the organizers try to keep the portfolio fairly well diversified. And it was the same there at the card show I visited. I think that out of about 100 booths there, you could find places featuring Magic, Lorcana, at least a few One Piece booths, as well as Yu-Gi-Oh! And Gundam. So these were really cool spots, showing that at this card show, every trading card game fan could find something for themselves. Of course, sports cards were definitely there too. But the vast majority, I think a solid 75 to 80%, were of course Pokemon vendors. However, among the attendees and customers, my impression was that about 96% of people were almost exclusively interested in Pokemon. There was some activity at the One Piece booths, but if anything sold, it was mostly sealed product, with singles selling in much smaller quantities. But we have to keep in mind that the nature of a card show is that these are not really places for big stores or large professional corporations. They're more for smaller traders, smaller shops, and collectors. And of course, in that setting, the singles market, compared with sealed product, is much, much bigger. And there were, or at least I saw, a huge number of slabs. Slabs that I would say maybe even twice as many as at a comparable card show not that long ago. Which brings me to my first hypothesis, which in light of recent announcements from PSA, is becoming more and more obvious. We are starting to notice a certain trend. A trend showing that graded cards and the grading process itself, the so-called grading play, are slowly becoming a bit overheated. What do I mean by that? Just a year ago, after doing a big review of my own collection and some cards I picked up through various deals, plus a few cards I managed to open here and there. Of course, there were also topics related to regrading when selling through PSA. That was a much more slippery topic, but the explanation that it was, after all, a one-off situation seems to have reassured at least some collectors. It reassured them so much that PSA's backlog became so long that they announced a suspension of grading. For a longer period, 10 months, they kept only the highest tiers. In other words, the express service for grading a card is now much, much more expensive. But this is clearly the result of how, over the past year, people noticed a very large financial gap that could be achieved through good pre-grading and sourcing cards locally. In many cases, PSA 10s brought much higher premiums. Even though this is always some kind of game of chance, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. If it works out often enough, then that premium from slab prices compared with raw card prices still seemed very, very large. As a result, a lot of people got into these grading plays. You could find good quality content about it on YouTube, and people simply started sourcing these cards and sending them in masse. The backlog became huge. Looking at how many slabs are already in circulation and how huge the numbers are that large partnerships are handling, personally, I get the impression that this market might be getting a little dangerous and a bit overvalued. Why do I think that? I'm looking at the historical context, at things, well, older than Pokemon, and those can probably only be found in sports cards. Sports cards, baseball, basketball, I don't know, American football, these are all things that people have been collecting for years. And all these types of cards have their chase cards, yeah. Popular Michael Jordan cards, or famous baseball players who first appeared as rookie cards and then became those rare chase cards, hard to pull from boxes, but highly sought after by collectors. They reached prices that were, let's say, unaffordable. For such a very beginner collector, let's say, someone without too much money to spend, but they were still, you could say, available to more dedicated collectors, who from time to time would set aside, let's say, a bit more money to add that chase card to their collection. But cards like that, popular cards people wanted to have in their collection, but still rare, well, usually had this price threshold. A threshold rarely crossed only by truly exceptional cards, was often around $1,000 already slabbed. And the argument that we currently have many more Pokemon fans compared with sports card fans is, of course, true. Here and now, yes, but we have to take into account the state of the hobby we are in right now. And at times, well, even the mania we are experiencing. On the market, it is worth asking whether Pokemon cards in slabbed 10s should really reach such high prices, and above all, have such high liquidity at those prices. Is it normal that a sports card among collectors who often come from multi-generational collecting families is usually still available to buy for $800 to $1,000? While in Pokemon, practically every set we have main chase cards over $1,000? And interestingly enough, many collectible cards from the very recent modern era are also now going for well over $2,000 or even $3,000 each. When you take a closer look at the population numbers, which are often found to be in the high tens of thousands, especially when it comes to cards graded as 10s, it really does seem to be a bit of an anomaly in the market. This situation is quite unusual and stands out compared to what you might typically expect. And that, to some extent, was my first main takeaway from Birmingham. Graded cards, this trend of chasing 10s, and the size of the PSA backlog show that this is an asset we definitely need to be careful with. I also used this opportunity to make a few trades, to move out of some of the more expensive singles and slabs, and simply exchange them for sealed product. In the British Isles, when it comes to sealed product, there's actually pretty good availability for things like the Pokemon Center ETBs. They're much harder to get your hands on in Europe right now. However, we have to keep in mind that there are some additional hidden costs involved, like VAT and customs duties. And that means we're still dealing with a bit of an anomaly here, one that's honestly pretty tough to take advantage of. But for individual collectors heading to card shows, being aware of these minor trends can be a great way to diversify their portfolios a little bit. But the second takeaway I had from observing and actually being there during the event is that the popularity of this hobby isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Tickets, of course, were completely sold out, and the lines were incredibly long. People were showing up with their binders, trading, and searching for specific cards. There's still a massive amount of interest in this, and despite what I mentioned earlier in that first point about slabs and being careful with prices, this second conclusion is actually much more positive. Potentially, it's the smaller collectors, parents coming with their kids, and people who love these cards most. They aren't necessarily buying slabs for 1,000 or 1,500 euros, but they're looking for specific cards for their collections, trading, and searching for new variants of those cards. Of course, over the last 30 years, we've seen so many different variants of Pokemon cards. There are so many ways for collectors to keep adding pieces to their collections, even if they only focus on a single Pokemon, a specific type, or a certain generation. Pokemon cards already offer a huge range in that regard, and we can see that with every new expansion. The Pokemon Company makes sure that collectors always have new reasons to get excited. So what does all of this mean? leading up to the 30th anniversary and through the end of this year, considering that Christmas is always strong. For Pokemon, I wouldn't really expect to see any particularly major fluctuations. What next year looks like will depend largely on the Pokemon Company's future plans, and on how strictly they decide to stick to their policies regarding card supply and reprints. It really comes down to whether they prioritize short-term greed or long-term planning. Right now, it's honestly mostly just guesswork. Still, there are plenty of people out there waiting for new products. It's a great time to just simply enjoy the hobby. If you have a card show nearby, go check it out. Just watch your wallet. Everyone will find something they suddenly want, so discipline is absolutely necessary. And if some slabs or cards are in risky price ranges, that's still just one part of this hobby. A fantastic, growing hobby that gives us all a lot of joy, and one we love. Once again, I warmly invite you to our Warsaw flagship store, and of course to our online store, cardhorizon.com, where you'll find the newest products at affordable prices.